Alberta teachers vote overwhelmingly to reject a tentative deal with the province. What comes next after Alberta Next? Plus, a new book on Canada's prime ministers and why this history matters. All that and more straight ahead on episode 35 of the Rob Breakenridge Show. Hey folks, welcome to this episode of the Rob Breakenridge Show. A lot to get to on the program. Later on, a conversation with one of the members of the Alberta Next panel. Now, that panel held its final in-person town hall Monday night in Calgary. A lot of questions, I guess, as to what comes out of this whole Alberta Next process. We'll be joined by Michael Binnion. He's also written a new paper on how Alberta could flex its legal and constitutional muscles to assert greater power within Canada. We'll find out more about that report, get his thoughts on some of the broader conversations happening around this whole Alberta Next process. Plus, a new book on the leaders who shaped this country and why this history matters. Author and historian J.D.M. Stewart will be with us to discuss his new book, The Prime Ministers, Canada's Leaders in the Nation They Shape. So all of that straight ahead. But let's begin with the breaking news Monday night in Alberta, and now the very strong likelihood that Alberta teachers will be on strike by this time next week. Teachers voted over the weekend on the latest offer from the Alberta government, and as we learned late Monday, that offer has been overwhelmingly rejected. A whopping 89.5% of teachers said no to what the province was offering. So at this point, it's hard to see what could possibly happen between now and the October 6th deadline that would avert job action. This was Alberta Teachers Association President Jason Schilling speaking at a press conference just shortly after those vote results were released.
My colleagues have spoken. 89.5% have voted to reject the Memorandum of Agreement. Teachers will be on strike on October 6th. For weeks, this government has tried to suggest that the ATA leadership is out of touch with members and barreling toward a strike, that somehow the ATA leadership is preventing a deal from being made. They are wrong. Because the ATA leadership respects and values members' opinions, we went directly to our teachers and asked them. Their response, the resounding and historical no that you have before you today. The proposed agreement failed to meet the needs of teachers, failed to improve student classroom conditions in a concrete and meaningful way, and failed to show teachers the respect they deserve. The undeniable truth is that Alberta spends the least per student on public education than any other province in Canada. It is the government who should be providing the necessities for public education. Teachers have been forced into an inappropriate position to have to bargain for these basics. It's deplorable that teachers should have to bargain for 1,500 educational assistants to support their students. It's deplorable that teachers should have to bargain to see their own numbers increase. Providing adequate numbers of teachers and appropriate student supports is not a luxury to negotiate. It is literally the job of government. And despite their bragging of record spending, the UCP have failed to fund for enrollment and in growth. The government points to a 12% raise over 4 years, claiming it is in line with other public sector agreements. That is misleading. Many other unions received more than just percentage increases, and they had significant salary improvements in the years leading up to their newly negotiated contracts. By contrast, teachers have seen less than 6% in total in over a decade. The government also insists that 12% would make Alberta's teachers the highest paid in Western Canada. This is simply untrue.
Okay, there's so pretty clear from the Alberta Teachers Association president, teachers will strike as of October 6th. Whether anything can be done in the coming days to avert that, I guess, is an open question. But you heard Jason Schilling go through why he believes teachers rejected this, what their concerns were with the province's deal. There was the question, I guess, of why it was put to a vote in the first place. And that's one of the questions that the Alberta government is asking. The statement that was released late Monday from the education minister says, with 2 failed ratification votes, I'm left questioning whether the union fully understands what their members are seeking. If teachers did not want this deal, then why was it proposed by the ATA in the first place? He goes on to say, I encourage the ATA's leadership to take time to meet with their members and gain clarity on what teachers are seeking out of a deal. Students and families deserve stability. The Alberta government goes on to defend what was on the table. And you heard Jason Schilling respond to some of this, but the education minister points out the deal would have provided a general wage increase of 12% over the 4-year term, as well as a wage grade unification, which would have provided more than 95% of teachers even larger wage increases up to 17%. They say it's now up to the union to determine its next steps. So it doesn't sound like the Alberta government is going to be offering anything new for teachers to consider, and the ATA is saying there will be a strike on October 6th. So it seems like we're barreling toward that, unless something dramatic happens in the coming days here. And this is kind of high stakes, too, in terms of where public opinion is going to come down and who's going to get blamed for this disruption. Is this the fault of the teachers for rejecting a deal and walking off the job? Is this the fault of the Alberta government for disrespecting teachers, for neglecting the education system and allowing it to get to this point? There's also the question, though, of what the Alberta government could still do in response. I mean, there was the option they could lock out teachers before a strike. Not sure what they would gain from doing so. But the other big question, and this has been floated a little bit in recent days, because it's happened before in Alberta where the Alberta government has legislated teachers back to work. I don't know how serious the Alberta government is considering that or how long things would have to go before they do seriously consider that. But that is something that could be on the table at some point and something else to consider here. So look, these are kids that, for a lot of them have already gone through the learning disruptions of the pandemic. Now they're facing this teacher strike, and who knows how long this could drag on for, given how far apart the two sides seem to be. And yes, there are pressures in the education system. And it is true, as the ATA points out, Alberta's per-student funding is the lowest or near the lowest in the country. Alberta continues to grow. That's a lot of growth in the education system. So we need teachers. We need more schools. We need to do all of these things. And how challenging is it for the Alberta government to do all of this at the same time? Give teachers a raise, hire more teachers, add more assistants, build more schools, do all of that. So like I say, I think Albertans will be examining and studying all of this and coming to their own conclusions about who's being reasonable and who's not in this whole situation. But that's where things stand as of Monday night. Teachers overwhelmingly rejecting this offer that the ATA still put to a vote in the first place. And it looks like we're headed to a strike next week. So we'll continue to follow that story. Just a moment here, we're going to shift gears and we'll talk about one of the issues coming out of this whole Alberta Next panel. In fact, that's where the Premier was Monday night in Calgary at the final in-person town hall of the Alberta Next panel. And this exercise in talking about what more Alberta can do to better assert its sovereignty within Canada or maybe take more decision-making power from the federal government. Michael Binnion is one of the members of that Alberta Next panel. He's actually written a new report for the macdonald-laurier Institute on this question. It's called How the West Wins, Alberta's Legal Pathway to Greater Power Within Canada. We'll get into that conversation in just a moment. You're listening to The Rob Breakenridge Show. Monday night in Calgary was the final in-person town hall being hosted by the Alberta government's Alberta Next panel, which of course is chaired by the Premier. The panel has been touring across the province, listening to Albertans and discussing a variety of topics, all of which are aimed at, as the Alberta Next website describes it, ways in which Alberta can strengthen sovereignty within a united Canada. Now, this has included a lot of focus on issues like an Alberta pension plan, an Alberta provincial police force, or even things like an Alberta tax collection agency, these kinds of things. Now, all of this comes as perhaps we're on the verge, maybe, of a breakthrough with the federal government and the potential that we could see a pipeline or some major new energy infrastructure get a green light as part of this new major projects approach from the Carney government. And certainly some recent comments from the Premier have indicated that maybe we're getting somewhere on this. And perhaps the federal government at the same time continuing to back away from some problematic policies on the energy and environment fronts, like some reports recently that the federal government might be prepared to back away from this proposed oil and gas emissions cap. So all of that is a bit of a backdrop here for the final town hall in this Alberta Next panel process. Of course, the question is, what next after Alberta Next? Here was some opening comments from Premier Danielle Smith at this event Monday evening in Calgary.
If Canada is going to be a strong and unified country, it must include a strong and sovereign Alberta within a united Canada, able to pursue our own potential without being held back by our own country and our own federal government. Our negotiating team has had very positive discussions with the federal government, but we do need to see action, and we need to see it soon. But of all the topics we're discussing tonight, they're all worth talking about because Albertans deserve to have a say in all of these issues. And regardless what each of us believes about these issues or which path we think is best, as Albertans we must be able to respectfully debate and discuss issues here with our friends and our family members and our neighbours. And I know that if we do that, in the end, our province will find the best solutions for the immense challenges we face, and we will come out stronger and freer than ever.
Okay, so again, you see the theme here, that this is about pushing back against federal policy, Alberta maybe seizing a little bit more power or having more of a say in how we're governed. And I think there's a lot of appeal to that, especially you look at the federal election results, and once again, Alberta voted one way, the rest of the country voted another way. And maybe that feeling, look, we just don't have any input. It doesn't matter what we say. Ottawa is going to do what it's going to do, and they'll answer to Canadians elsewhere in the country. That at least if it was an Alberta government making decisions in some of these areas, they'd be more accountable to us as Albertans. Now, to that end, there's an interesting new paper out from the MacDonald-Laurier Institute written by one of the members of the Alberta Next panel. It's called How the West Wins, Alberta's Legal Pathway to Greater Power Within Canada. And certainly that dovetails into a lot of what the Alberta Next panel has been exploring. Joining us for more is the author of that paper, as mentioned, a member of the Alberta Next panel, Michael Binnion, is CEO of Questerre Energy, Executive Director and founder of the Modern Miracle Network. He's also chair of the Canada Strong and Free Network. Again, you can read this paper. It's up at macdonald-laurier.ca. Michael, so great to have you with us here. Welcome back to the program.
Yeah, well, it's nice to be back with you as well, Rob. Thank you.
Yeah, likewise. Well, like I say, I mean, this really speaks to a lot of what's being discussed in Alberta right now, in this kind of moment we're at and exploring or maybe trying to change our relationship with the rest of Canada. So how do you see all of this tying together, first of all?
Well, I think I think one thing I've come to realize through my time in Quebec and across the country that, Canada is made up of some very distinct cultures. And of course, we've all finally now we accepted, and in fact, I think the Parliament has passed a resolution to say that Quebec is a distinct society and Quebec is a distinct culture, and it has some in terms of our federation, which has been asymmetrical from the beginning, that some provinces have different deals than other provinces. That I think we have accepted to greater or lesser extent the fact that Quebec is distinct and has some distinct constitutional advantages. What I've realized through my time of accepting and understanding, French and Quebec culture is our own, and the prairies also have a distinct culture, and there's no monopoly that Quebec has on distinctness or uniqueness. And what I think is that we are looking to say that we have a country that has a lot of things in common, but we also have our own distinct cultures and want to have some sovereignty because of that. Mm-hmm.
Why do you think this matters, though? And why do you think it's become such an issue, or it's really been thrust to the forefront so much right now?
Well, I do think, and as I discuss in my paper, that there has been, over our constitutional history from 1763, we generally were moving power towards the people being governed. Power moved from London, England, to Ottawa, Canada. And of course, we've also been moving to some extent power from Ottawa to provinces in terms of, the actual creation of Alberta and Saskatchewan in 1905. We just created a new territory with a lot of self-government in northern Canada. But I would say maybe starting with Pierre Elliott Trudeau, there's been a little bit of a counter trend to try to centralize some powers in Ottawa. Trudeau used the reason that this was necessary to create a charter-based constitution. And of course, he was successful in changing the constitution that way. But we've also seen this with Chrétien and Paul Martin, where they were arguing it was needed for healthcare, that we, a national healthcare, that we need to centralize power. And then most recently, Justin Trudeau made the argument we need to centralize power for a national environmental policy and a national sales tax on carbon. So these have reversed the trend that we've had for 200 and some years, where power on an evolutionary slow basis moves towards the people being governed, and we've seen a counter trend in recent decades.
There's kind of the central question, and you speak to it in the piece, as to whether this is given or taken, whether we need to ask Ottawa for autonomy or whether it's there for Alberta to take, to assert itself.
Yeah, I think that I think that's maybe something that sometimes some very fair-minded Albertans think, well, we'll just have a discussion and people will nicely agree to just give us some more power, and
Right.
I don't think that's how it worked. Certainly Canada is not like, France or Russia or America that had, violent revolutions to become independent. Canada's, that's certainly not been we became independent through this process of responsible government, that as you demonstrate the ability to govern yourself, power moves closer to the people being governed. So I think, but I don't believe that the people in the United Kingdom just gave that to Canada. I think we had to assert ourselves. I think World War I was a pivotal moment for Canada to get more independence. We showed in World War I that we were now a nation that could field a competent army. And I think that was an important demonstration of self-government. And it probably maybe didn't lead directly, but the Statute of Westminster in 1931 was probably in part justified by the fact, why would English law be supreme over Canadian law when Canada has now proved it doesn't need Britain to defend us? We can field our own army.
Right. But I mean, in terms of, is there a need to change the Constitution to address all of this? Or I guess, is there an avenue here for Alberta within the confines of what already exists to assert itself and to sort of take some of that autonomy for itself?
Yeah. Okay. Well, I would say one of the biggest arguments in my paper is that under the constitutional tradition and unwritten conventions of our Constitution, the key one I'm referring to is responsible government, the ability to govern yourself, that you have to first demonstrate the ability to govern yourself. Britain doesn't give you that Canadian law will be supreme over English law if you still need them to defend yourself because you don't have an army, right? So we have to demonstrate self-government first. And so my message to Albertans is, when we're unhappy with the way the federal government treats us, when we're unhappy that they're trying to take jurisdiction back, or they're trying to centralize powers, or they're trying to legislate in our areas of sovereignty, that the answer is not to complain and protest and be, in some sense, as people in central Canada tell me when I'm down there, you're kind of like whiny teenagers, like you're the richest people in the country. Why do you whine and complain all the time? Like, the answer is to grow up in a constitutional way, prove that we can govern ourselves, much as Quebec has invested in for 2 generations. Quebec didn't ask for independence or even suggest that they would have a referendum on it until they had demonstrated they could govern themselves through managing their own money and pensions, policing themselves, collecting their own taxes, co-managing immigration, co-managing trade. I mean, they have trade offices in many international cities. So they first showed they could govern themselves and then said, hey, we should have a right to have more power. And I think Alberta has to do the same thing for 2 reasons. One is, it's how our constitutions work for 250 years. So it's the legal rule of law way to do it. But the other practical reality is, how do you become independent if you can't manage yourself?
So does that mean, what are the first steps then to that? Does that mean sort of building up those institutions, or starting to see Alberta assert itself in these areas where they could have some jurisdiction?
Yeah, so I'm talking about things we talked about for a long time. I mean, it's do we want an Alberta police force? Do we want to have an Alberta pension plan? Do we want to collect Alberta taxes? Do we want to, as the Constitution says, immigration Section 95 it's shared jurisdiction. Both the provinces and the federal government, like taxes, another shared jurisdiction. So we should assert ourselves in these areas of exclusive and shared jurisdiction, not as a protest or some way of getting back, but more part of that. We're 5 million people here now, and just in Alberta, well over 6 in the prairies, and it's time for us to show that we can govern ourselves. And in so doing, I think a bunch of things happen. One is we're within the rule of law and what our Constitution says about devolution of powers. Two, we improve our bargaining position relative to other provinces and the federal government. And three, we are proving that we can manage ourselves.
Yeah. And also where there is a need for negotiation with Ottawa, do you believe that gives Alberta then, or would give Alberta more leverage?
Yeah, well, the metaphor I use is that when a 14-year-old tells her parents, "I'm really angry with all these rules, and you're making me come home, and that's it. I'm moving out of the house," and the parents go, "But you don't have an education, you don't have any money, you don't have a place to live, and you can't pay the rent. I don't really think you're going to move out of the house," right? Well, to some extent, Alberta's saying, we're mad. You're interfering with our jurisdiction. It's not fair. We're going to sue you in court, and so on and so forth. And if you don't listen to us, we're going to move out of the country. And they look at us and go, "But you don't manage your own money. We have it all. You don't police yourselves. You don't collect your own taxes. Like, how are you going to move out of the house?"
Right. So there's an opportunity for Alberta to do these things. It's not a question of waiting for permission then from Ottawa.
Right. And all I'm saying is, because people have talked about this for a while, what I'm saying is that let's not just do it because we're trying to get back at somebody, or we're trying to protest, or we're trying to, we're just being angry. Like, let's not do it for that reason. Let's do it because it's a natural evolution of the country. It's how the country itself got more autonomy from Britain, is how provinces can have more autonomy from Ottawa. Let's do it as an exercise in maturity and an exercise in responsible self-government.
Is Alberta better off, though, by going that path? I mean, certainly we have prospered. I would argue we've probably prospered to a far greater extent than Quebec has, even with everything that Quebec has managed to wrest from Ottawa. But is the end goal here better governance, or what is it we're after, do you think?
Well, I made the point about the Alberta Next panel because, a lot of people, it's interesting. It was very interesting to be on the panel to see what issues come up and what people are concerned about. But one clear thing that came up was people just so angry with the premier or with the government or with their lives, and a lot of people made the point, why am I against this? It's not because I'm against the idea of us managing our own money. It's because I don't trust you. I don't like you. And one answer I had was, you've got a panel in front of you with the premier and 3 MLAs. And in almost every one of those panels, the local MLAs were in the room. And so it was an actual literal example of responsible government. Your government was there to listen to you. And even if you were angry with them, even if you wanted to tell them how much you didn't trust them, the fact of the matter was they were there in the room with you, and you had the opportunity as a citizen to talk to them directly. You could go to the mic. You could talk to the MLAs at the back. People stayed after the panel to mingle. You had an opportunity to talk to your own government. And that, to me, was like a proof point. I don't think Mark Carney's going to go around Alberta with some MPs to do that. I don't think he will. And so there's an example of why I think being able to govern ourselves with people who are accessible to Albertans is better, and better governance and more responsible government.
Right. And to that point, I think, and why we've seen the frustration since the federal election is that it feels like Alberta doesn't really have much of a say in who runs things in Ottawa, whereas Albertans have complete say in terms of who runs things in Alberta. So if the Alberta government has more say in these areas, they're more directly accountable to Albertans.
Yep. And I would say the other thing that was interesting about the number, and as I said, it was genuinely interesting to hear from people and to see the passion and sometimes the vehement anger that some people have for whatever's going on either in their life or what their view of politics is. It was very, I don't want to say rewarding, but very interesting to experience that and to want to understand where they're coming from. But I did sort of think you're implicitly saying, and they were always a minority, by the way, like the majority of people that came out of these panels were very supportive, right? But the minority of people, I think it's important to listen to them. And I'm thinking, but implicitly what you're saying is you trust people in central Canada to look after Alberta better than Albertans would. And it doesn't feel logically. I mean, my first mentor in life, when he was talking about business and he was talking about taking care of your business, his metaphor always was, nobody takes care of your children like you do.
Yeah.
And I'm sort of thinking, why would we let somebody else take care of our children? Like, why would we not want the ability to have, metaphorically and literally our children taking care of people that we have access to and that we can tell them when we're angry?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, based on what you've been seeing and hearing through this whole process and what you've laid out in this paper, does it feel like we're kind of on the cusp here of some change? So what do you make of this moment we're at now?
Yeah, I will tell you, I do feel that as soon as I did at every one of these panels, as soon as I told people, understand that Canada became independent through this process of responsible self-government, that the light went on for a lot of people. Yeah, what Alberta's doing is nothing different or nothing less traditional, nothing less within our constitutional history, traditions, and law than what Canada itself did. We're not irresponsible. We're not irresponsible, angry people just wanting to protest. We're literally following the way this country's worked for over 200 years.
Well, we'll see what comes of the Alberta Next process. Of course, that's soon to be wrapping up. And in the meantime, this paper is up at macdonald-laurier.ca. Michael, thank you so much for making some time for us here today. Really appreciate the insight on all this.
Anytime, Rob. I appreciate you having me. Thank you.
Once again, that was Michael Binnion. He's the author of this paper for the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, How the West Wins, Alberta's Legal Pathway to Greater Power Within Canada. He is, of course, a member of the Alberta Next panel. He's CEO at Questar Energy, executive director and founder of the Modern Miracle Network. So he put some interesting ideas forward. And again, I think there was something to that broader idea that Albertans want their elected officials to be more accountable to them, in the sense that maybe we feel like our federal government just isn't. That regardless of how Alberta votes, the federal government is something different, doing something other than Albertans seem to want. Now, look, clearly Albertans are not monolith, and I don't know that any region of the country can claim that the federal government is doing exactly what it is they want, but there is that disconnect. It's certainly been exacerbated by the federal election results. And so I think there's some appeal in saying the Alberta government should be doing more of these things. And that way we're more accountable to you, the Alberta voters. But does that necessarily make the case for an Alberta pension plan or Alberta provincial police force? I mean, these are ideas that I think you can look at each on its own merits. Although I do think it's what the province is looking at coming out of all of this. Whether they make these decisions or put those questions to a vote, I guess we'll see. But Monday was the final in-person town hall for the Alberta Next panel. We got the session of the legislature beginning later this month, and we'll see what the Alberta government has in store. Coming up in just a moment, we're going to talk about Canadian leaders, prime ministers specifically. New book about, well, frankly, all the prime ministers. Historian, author J.D.M. Stewart is the author of a new book. It's called The Prime Ministers, Canada's Leaders and the Nation They Shaped. Why these stories matter, why these people matter, and why this history matters. You're listening to The Rob Breakenridge Show. Joining us now to talk more about his new book, about Canada's prime ministers, the importance of Canadian history and the figures who shaped it. Very pleased to welcome to the program here J.D.M. Stewart. He's a writer, historian, one of Canada's leading experts on Canada's prime ministers. And his new book, it's called The Prime Ministers, Canada's Leaders and the Nation They Shaped. James, so great to have you with us here. Welcome to the program.
Thanks, Rob. Great to be here.
Let's start by talking about why you think this book is needed and kind of what prompted you to write this in the first place.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's I've been a history teacher for 30 years, and I've always felt that Canadian history was very important, but also the leadership story of Canada is very important. And believe it or not, it's been more than 25 years since anyone has written a book chronicling the history of Canadian prime ministers. You have to go back to 1999, a book by Jack Granatstein and Norm Hilmer. There was also one in 1994 called Right Honorable Men by Michael Bliss, but that's a long time ago. That's the 1990s. And we have had a whole swath of history over the last quarter century. And so I felt that it was time to bring to a new generation of readers, a new generation of Canadians who might not be up to speed on this history. I thought it'd be time to bring this kind of a book to the marketplace.
Well, it's interesting because, writing a biography of any one individual is quite a task. So this is
Yes.
almost like, writing smaller biographies of a whole bunch of Canadian prime ministers. And did you consider focusing on maybe just one or two, or what was the approach you wanted to bring here?
I wanted to have an all-encompassing single volume book that any Canadian could pick up and have as a handy reference any prime minister in Canadian history, from Sir John A. Macdonald to Mark Carney, because the book does include a short chapter on Mark Carney. So, obviously, because I was writing about 24 different prime ministers, you can't include every single thing about them. And part of the time when I was writing this book, I was like, this could actually be a 600-page book because there's a lot to say.
Yeah.
So I think, you would miss something if you only focused on, say, the 4 most important prime ministers in Canadian history or something like that. So I wanted there to be something for everybody, and something that covered the whole entire period of Canadian history from 1867 to the present.
Well, it's interesting, that question of, what counts as history. I think for a lot of people, it depends maybe on how old you are and what you've seen in your lifetime. There's sort of that line between these figures who are history and those who are very contemporary, the politicians of today versus kind of these giant looming figures of history. And I guess there really is no clear dividing line there, is there?
No, but I would say that anyone who served as Prime Minister of Canada was a piece of our history. In fact, I quote the well-known journalist and writer Peter C. Newman, who's now deceased. I quote him in my introduction and say, an hour in the office of the Prime Minister is an hour in the history of the country. So prime ministers have made a huge impact on Canadian history, and it's important that we understand them. Of course, there are other elements of Canadian history that are important if you want to get into, say, social history or military history or other aspects. But history at the leadership level, at the prime ministerial level, is very important. And in some cases, it's been kind of pushed aside by some of the other types of history that have been coming to the fore. But this is another reason why I wanted to write the book, was to bring forward this top-level, leadership-based history of Canada.
Yeah. You take 2 recent figures, Stephen Harper and Justin Trudeau, and they were very consequential in their own way. They're
Yes.
still very much a product of this era, and strong feelings on both sides. We think of them as politicians. Like, we don't think of them yet, I think, as historical figures. Is that to say that in 20, 50, 75 years, the way in which we think about these individuals will be different?
Yes, I think that goes without saying. It's a really good point that you bring up, Rob. In history, you need distance in order to really make a dispassionate judgment on a historical figure. So in some ways, writing chapters about Stephen Harper and Justin Trudeau, they were some of the more challenging chapters for me to write, because they're still very fresh in our memories. So the interpretations of both of their times in office will change in the ensuing years. I think Harper's time in office, he's been out of office, believe it or not, for 10 years now, which is a big chunk of time. I think the perspectives on his time in office are already starting to change, as you see, okay, well, here's how Justin Trudeau handled his years in office, and that to some degree makes Stephen Harper's years in office look a little bit different. And so 25 years from now, we will certainly be looking at both of these men's time in office a little bit differently than we do today.
Mm-hmm. When we look at prime ministers, there were those who accomplished what we would consider to be great things, and there were those who had great political success. And I suppose those are not necessarily the same things, but how do we disentangle the two to assess who these individuals were, the impact that they had?
Well, you've got to look at the impact of the achievements or of the legislation. So let's take a couple of examples. Sir John A. Macdonald and the construction of the railway. That is still a long-lasting impact on Canada still today. Our railways are still some of the most important things that are part of the infrastructure of Canada. If you look at a prime minister like Louis Saint Laurent, who doesn't get a lot of attention, but he was really successful in positioning Canada for the post-Second World War era by getting us into NATO. He also built the Trans-Canada Highway. So if you look at, I always like to see how long-lasting were the achievements of the prime ministers. And one of the things I try to do in the book also is look at their legacies post prime ministership. And some prime ministers last longer in the Canadian psyche than others. Pierre Trudeau is another prime minister, and he's been out of office for more than 40 years, but his time in office is still having repercussions in various ways.
Mm-hmm. When it comes to knowing about these individuals, and it goes back, I guess, to how we approach history and teach history, and maybe it's about the things that happened as opposed to the people who caused those things to happen. And I don't know, maybe we're less inclined than the Americans, to put historical figures on a pedestal.
Yeah.
What do you make of how we teach history? And is this book in part trying to fill a void?
It's definitely trying to fill a void. It depends on where you live in the country. For example, I live in Ontario, where there is a required course in Canadian history in high school in grade 10, whereas in Alberta, there is no defined Canadian history course that a student must take to graduate from high school. There's a social studies course that is a mishmash of economics, civics, geography, and other things. So there are holes in the Canadian education system. There are also holes just in the Canadian historical understanding, because as you were mentioning, the Americans, they're publishing books about American history all the time. They have their documentaries, they have even their films, which films can pique interest in history, but I wouldn't mix them up with an understanding of history. But I am trying to fill a void, and I think there is more casual interest in Canadian history right now as we are searching for some of the ties that bind in this country during the period where some of our sovereignty as a nation is being threatened by the United States. And so this is an opportunity for Canadians to pick up a book that's written for the general audience and say, I didn't know that. This is kind of interesting to see how our country unfolded.
I think you're right. I think history can be unifying. We've seen recently in ways in which it can be dividing. And I mean, that gets us into, I guess, what we could call the statue debates. Much of that is around John A. Macdonald, but not mm-hmm. exclusively. And the sort of reckoning with certain aspects of the past, but going from kind of lionizing individuals from the past to almost villainizing figures from the past.
Well, this is, there are a lot of uses and abuses in history. And that's a reference to a title of a book by historian Margaret Macmillan, who talks about bad history, where people use selective bits of history to try to make a point instead of using a balanced and very informed look at a historical subject. And John A. Macdonald, I think, is one historical figure who has suffered from a very particular small focus on his legacy as opposed to looking at the whole thing. So history is a very funny thing. As you mentioned, it can be used and abused, and people use it to advance an agenda as opposed to, which is my view, I like to advance an understanding. And so to advance an understanding, you've got to look at both sides of the issue. And these are the kinds of things that I do in my book. I address the statue issue of Sir John A. Macdonald. I address his Indigenous policy, both for the good parts of it and the bad parts of it. And to me, that balanced approach is what's important when you're trying to develop historical understanding.
What do you think makes somebody statue worthy, I guess, if we can put it that way? I mean, a statue of John A. Macdonald is not a way of saying that this is this perfect individual we all must aspire to. I think maybe it's more of a recognition of historical significance and impact. But how do you approach that question?
Well, I think the notion of who we might build a statue to today is changing. We are much less inclined to revere leadership people in our society today. I think we have appreciation for the ordinary citizen who has done great things. Terry Fox would be a great example. And there are others, community leaders. It depends on where you live, but we're for good or ill, we don't really want to lionize people who were in leadership positions anymore. So that's kind of changing. It's not necessarily a bad thing, but I think, whether there's a statue or not, we still need to pay attention to the people that the Canadian people have asked to lead the country during the elections that happen every few years. So whether they deserve a statue or not, I think that's for future generations to decide. We can decide who our own heroes are, and that's what we do. Mm-hmm. I think we're more focused, I think, also on people who bring us pleasure, athletes, musicians, literary stars, people of this nature. So we look other places than politics now.
Right. And really, ultimately, I guess the first step in assessing whether someone deserves a statue or deserves recognition or whatever the case is to at least know who they were, know what they did, know the impact they had. It's ultimately, we need to know the history first.
The other thing, Rob, I would say is, there is this false belief that if we built a statue to someone that they must have been a god, or they must have been a perfect person. And if there's anything we can take away from this polarizing, statue vandalizing ridiculousness that happened over the last 5 years, I think it would be to understand that everybody is human. And if you're in a leadership position, or you're the school principal, or you're the firefighter down the street, we're all human. And there's lots of things we've done to celebrate, but people make mistakes too. And also people are products of their time. So these are things we need to understand and have a little grace and humanity when we're looking at people from the past.
Yeah.
Or even in the present, to be frank, right? Even in the present, we should all have grace and humanity towards each other.
As the title implies, these are individuals who shaped our history. And maybe there's the tendency to think that history was just going to unfold as it did, regardless of who was in power, almost like these people coincided with history as opposed to shaping it. When you look at the nature of our system and the role that these individuals play, is it fair to give them that amount of credit for what happened during their tenures? The suggestion maybe that it wouldn't have. I mean, the formation of Canada is a big question. Maybe it still would have happened without Macdonald, for example. But how much credit do you think prime ministers deserve here?
Well, there's two things I'd say in response to you there, Rob. And one is that in history, nothing is inevitable. You can change one circumstance before, and that can completely change the outcome of an event. So nothing is inevitable. Number two is history is sometimes described as a collision between character and circumstance. So it does depend on what the circumstances are, but it also depends on the character, the person who is there at the time. So if we take an example like the Second World War, Mackenzie King was the prime minister, and he had an uncanny ability to be able to not push things too far, get Canada muddling along, control, exert Canadian sovereignty, placate Quebec or manage them as best they could. And he was successful and turned out to be our longest serving prime minister. People matter. Decisions matter. The person at the top leading the way does make a difference. And if you look at any prime minister and read any chapter of my book, you'll see that decisions made by the prime minister have made a difference. You just choose whatever prime minister you want, and you're going to see that that's the result.
Yeah. And it's interesting, too, when you think about what might have or could have been. I mean, you talk in the book about a figure that probably most of us don't know much about or think much about, John Thompson, a prime minister who I think maybe much was expected of, ended up actually dying in office, right? These kinds of examples.
Yeah, I mean, I guess there's an example of what could have happened. For example, if Sir John Thompson had not died of a heart attack in Windsor Castle, it's kind of an interesting story. He was having lunch with Queen Victoria in 1894, and he had a heart attack and died, and then was sent home on a morning ship. But the issue there was what could have happened with him. And he didn't get a chance to fulfill his leadership abilities. He had quite a few, but things happen and people get bumped out of office. For another example would be 1979, when Pierre Trudeau lost to the Joe Clark Progressive Conservatives. People thought Trudeau's time in office was over, but then a year later he won the 1980 election, and we know that from 80 to 84, a lot happened.
Yeah, to say the least. But it is funny too. I mean, Trudeau in those last 4 years does something incredibly consequential, significant to his legacy. But the Liberals are drummed out of office. So Brian Mulroney, brings in free trade, and this is so crucial to his legacy. He goes down toward the end as one of the most unpopular prime ministers ever. It's sort of that double-edged sword of legacy, or the doing the things that matter, but also the political consequences of the day.
Right. The Mulroney example is a really good one that you raise because, as you say, he was the most unpopular prime minister in Canadian history when he left office in 1993. But then when he died last year in 2024, there were hardly any bad words spoken about his time in office. This is the whole thing I was talking about at the beginning of our talk, where when time passes on, the interpretations of prime ministers change. And Mulrooney's post-prime ministership was very much an up and down period, but at his death, he's ended very much up in terms of people's analysis of his time in office.
What's your read on how these individuals, the ones who serve in this position, hold this office? Do you think they appreciate the history of it, the gravity of it, the potential for that kind of lasting legacy?
Yeah, I think all prime ministers, I think they all come into the office for good reasons, to try to make Canada a better place. I think any prime minister always has an eye on history and legacy. What will they be remembered for? And I'm quite certain that drives a lot of their decisions, particularly at the beginning of their time in office, but even more so as the longer they get in office, they start thinking about, well, what will I be remembered for? So they're very much aware of their place in history. And, Stephen Harper, just as another example, he was a big fan of Canadian history and prime minister history, read the biographies of Diefenbaker, was a big appreciator of the political skills of Jean Chrétien. So many of these men in office, Mackenzie King, for example, loved Laurier too. So they're all very cognizant of their place in Canadian history. And remember, it's a pretty small club. There's only been 24 people in the history of Canada to have been prime minister.
Yeah. You mentioned Diefenbaker, and I spoke with another author recently who'd written a book about Diefenbaker, and part of what he was trying to get across is maybe how underappreciated Diefenbaker was. Did you feel that there are those, I don't know if unsung heroes is the right way to put it, but
right,
maybe prime ministers who didn't quite get the due they deserved?
Well, unfortunately, a lot of our prime ministers just get forgotten. So Diefenbaker is one who gets forgotten, but my go-to person to answer this question would be Louis Saint Laurent. He served in office from 1948 to 1957, and really positioned Canada for the post-Second World War era. He got us into NATO. He set out what a strong foreign policy would be. St. Lawrence Seaway was built during that time. Trans-Canada Pipeline. So he's not well remembered. You don't see his name in other history books or reference to him in speeches or newspaper articles. He's kind of the forgotten prime minister, to be honest.
So coming out of this, and we talked about, the statue debate and how we approach history. And, there is this sense now too, that maybe, we're talking about this club of old white men, and maybe it's not fashionable to spend a lot of time thinking about them or holding them up as heroes of history. But do you think there's an opportunity here? Are we at a bit of a turning point, do you think, when it comes to knowing and appreciating our history?
I hope we are, and maybe we'll find out depending on how many books I can sell on this topic. But I think, it does ebb and flow sometimes. So I was remembering in the 1990s, when it was the 50th anniversary of D-Day from the Second World War, 1994, there seemed to be an increased increased interest in Canadian military history for some time. And now, again, because of what's happening in our relationship with the United States, people are wondering about the ties that bind us. And hopefully this is a period where we are trying to develop a greater understanding of who we were as a nation. But it's it's up to Canadians themselves how far they want to go with trying to understand ourselves. But I do think we are at a turning point like that.
The book is called The Prime Ministers, Canada's Leaders, and the Nation They Shaped. J.D.M. Stewart, thank you so much for joining us here today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Rob.
Right. Once again, that was J.D.M. Stewart, historian, author. His latest book, it's called The Prime Ministers, Canada's Leaders and the Nation They Shaped. Listen, that's where we will leave it for this episode of the Rob Breakenridge Show. Coming up on Wednesday, we'll have a new episode of the Line Alberta podcast, an in-depth look at minimum wage policy in Alberta. As of October 1st, Alberta will officially have the lowest minimum wage in the country as Saskatchewan pulls ahead of Alberta. So we'll explore that issue coming up Wednesday on the Line Alberta podcast. We'll be back with a new episode of the Rob Breakenridge Show for you on Friday. We'll see what happens with this whole teacher situation. As noted earlier, the Alberta government, including the Premier, Minister of Finance and the Minister of Education will be providing an update on Tuesday at noon. So we'll see how the province responds to teachers overwhelmingly rejecting the offer from the province. Also coming up on Friday, a conversation with the director and the producer, Barry Alberta and Mark Selby, respectively, of the documentary called The Road Between Us, The Ultimate Rescue. And you might recall this received a lot of attention, a controversy at the Toronto International Film Festival, when initially they didn't want to screen this documentary. Ultimately, it actually ended up winning the People's Choice Documentary Awards at the festival, and it is set for nationwide release: Calgary, Edmonton, Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver, on Friday, October 3rd. Now, this is a documentary that explores the horrific terror attack committed by Hamas against Israelis almost 2 years ago now, October 7th, 2023. And of course, everything that has followed since then. Now, this all comes, by the way, amid some word on Monday that maybe things are moving closer to some sort of a ceasefire or even a broader peace agreement. I guess we'll see what happens there. But it is an important story about what happened on that day, October 7th, 2023. So we'll, as mentioned, have Director Barry Alberta and producer Mark Selby with us. Conversation coming up on Friday's episode of the Rob Breakenridge Show. Thanks so much for joining us here. Again, robbreakenridge.ca. We will talk to you later this week. Take care.